Workers answer the union call for one of the city's biggest protests.
Maintain the momentum, maintain the anger, maintain your rage against the Kennett government.
Good evening. The union movement is tonight planning the next stage of its guerrilla war against the Kennett government, a complete shutdown of the state public transport system on Friday week. The move follows today's general strike, which saw 100,000 protesters bring the city to a standstill. Michael Perry begins our coverage.
Victoria's industrial relations time bomb began ticking early this morning, striking prison officers, refusing to lock up unionists who could be jailed under the government's employment reforms.
First of all, there's not enough jail. I mean, the MCG wouldn't be big enough to hold all the unionists that will be fined as a result of either today or future activities.
Nurses and health workers were also soon in the front line, leaving hospitals with only emergency crews. But Victoria's industrial emergency was only beginning.
What do we want? When do we want it? Now!
Thousands of workers across the state converged on the city in the fight to defend their wages and jobs.
If we can make a difference, then it's worth it, definitely. And I think we can make a difference if we all stand up and be counted.
Police were also on the move, following Melbourne's recent history of violent protests. Dozens of specialist officers assigned to protect the strike's political targets inside Parliament House. Others combed nearby rooftops following a bomb threat against the rally. But there was no turning back, and police horses were issued with protective visors for the first time to deflect any airborne missiles. The government's last-minute plea for a strike boycott was ignored as workers flocked in droves to the call to arms. With many schools closed, parents took care of their own children to ensure the rally wouldn't be forgotten by the young.
Being part of history today, because today will be a historic day. They've tried to turn the clock back 100 years and we're just standing up for our rights.
Even those working couldn't resist a glimpse at the day Melbourne stood still. But for some, the crush was too much. Unionists said they wouldn't gauge the strike's success on crowd numbers alone, but even they were stunned by the turnout.
He said that, half in a few of his hardline mates will turn up. Well, I'm very pleased I've got so many mates, I must say.
And with crowds now circling entire city blocks, police and organisers soon described the 100,000-strong protest as Melbourne's biggest ever, rivalling the Vietnam moratoriums. The march is just the first step in the union movement's campaign, which could render Victoria not just unworkable, but also ungovernable, and force Jeff Kennett back to the polls to prove he has a mandate for the employment reforms. Emotions ran high as the marchers surged towards Parliament House. But the demonstration became violent only when two men attempted to break through police lines and were arrested. Meanwhile, union leaders were warning of more chaos on the way.
This union will close the ports, and every day there'll be some form of action.
And trades hall power brokers foreshadowed a new class war.
What we say to you, what we ask of you, to maintain the momentum, maintain the anger, maintain your rage against the Kennett government.
Michael Peary, National 9 News.
And while the Premier acknowledges the size of today's massive demonstration, he won't be swayed. Mr Kennett says industrial reform will go ahead, and he won't talk to Trades Hall boss John Halfpenny until the threat of further industrial action is lifted. More from Simon Clark.
For the first time ever, a Victorian Premier arrived at Parliament House under armed guard. His two plain-clothed police bodyguards immediately took up positions outside Mr Kennett's office at the front of the building. The former Premier soon emerged to acknowledge the crowd with a different salute. Mrs Kerner didn't endorse the strike, but many of her MPs took part in the rally.
I feel very sad that in 1992 people have to demonstrate in these numbers to protect democracy.
Some in the crowd, though, were clearly still resentful of her government's part in Victoria's decline, with two of her MPs bearing the brunt.
Silly mongrels! You Labor mongrels! Go and join the Liberal bastard mates!
Despite this almost overwhelming display of popular resistance, the government says it is determined to push on and will ram its industrial reform legislation through both houses of Parliament as soon as possible. The Parliament got underway as the last of the demonstrators dispersed. The Premier perhaps relieved the ordeal was over.
And I can understand those who demonstrated today and did so, I thought, in good spirit and did so responsibly, and I can congratulate all involved in the way in which it was conducted. They are confused. They have been fed a great deal of misinformation.
The government's legislative program would not be changed. Later, Mr Kennett said he wanted to go out to address the crowd, but had been advised he wouldn't be heard. He said he didn't feel threatened by the demonstration, but confirmed he and other ministers had received threats.
It's not only my security, it's that of some of my colleagues, and it is certainly that of some of our families.
Simon Clark, National 9 News.
Despite the huge crowd demonstrating in the city centre, most Victorians chose to go to work today. But they could hardly claim it was just another working day. Many feared union retribution if they were identified. Ian Neal continues our coverage.
Whether it was hard yakka or the hard sell, most Victorians with a job were on the job. Apart from rally-related congestion, public transport ran normally. But the number of commuters heading into the city to work was well down. Early inbound traffic was also substantially less than the normal Tuesday, more like school holidays. But this was no holiday, and schools like Templestowe Heights Primary were largely unaffected.
We know that there will be changes, but we don't know what they will be yet. So we decided to stay at work.
Prep and Grade 1 teacher Helene Alsop is the local union rep at Templestowe Heights. She and her colleagues met last week and decided that to strike today would be premature.
We did accept that the 17.5% holiday pay loading wasn't viable at this time, so we were quite happy for that to be removed from our wages too.
Fire and ambulance officers were also on the job as normal, these units attending a roof collapse in North Melbourne.
Most people on the job today, boys?
Yeah, as far as we know.
Despite the absence of nursing and catering staff, Melbourne's major hospitals were at pains to stress that today was business as usual. But many volunteers pointed out that just because they're working, that doesn't necessarily mean they're supporting the policies of the Kennett government. Small business also reported low absenteeism.
Full roll-up, everybody's here that's employed here.
And why did they come?
Well, we work for a small company, non-union. We believe in negotiating with the boss anything we want, so we're quite happy to come here and negotiate with their employees.
And was that unanimous?
That was unanimous, yes.
At Myer Melbourne, just 50 of 2,000 employees exercised their right to strike.
Well, I think we've got tremendously loyal staff. We found that it's only a very small percentage of people who have chosen to be away today.
And in a resounding slap in the face to John Halfpenny, workers at the SPC cannery at Shepparton rejected a call by his daughter Bronwyn to join today's strike. Ian Neal, National 9 News.
Premier Jeff Kennett today carried out the Coalition's pre-election promise to remove Darcy Dugan from his post as head of the Gaming Commission.
Mr Dugan no longer holds that position, and now Mr Richards has been appointed chairman of the Gaming Commission.
Mr Kennett called for Mr Dugan's resignation after he accepted a free plane trip from controversial American gaming machine supplier Video Lottery Consultants. The Coalition claimed the former Chief Magistrate and his Director of Gaming, Howard Ronaldson, had compromised their investigation by accepting the flight. In his second week in office, the Premier confirmed he would replace Mr Dugan. The new Gaming Commission Chairman, John Richards, is Chairman of the Casino Control Authority. A teenage joyrider who...
Maintain the momentum, maintain the anger, maintain your rage.
Protest. In Melbourne, more than 100,000 people took to the streets in a display of anger against Premier Jeff Kennett's industrial reforms. Unions say the march and statewide strike was just the beginning, a warning to those who believe Victoria should be the blueprint for sweeping national changes. Virginia Hausiger reports.
Class war government. They're seeking to impose their
punishment, if you like, on the working people of Victoria.
In just weeks, Victoria's new Premier has turned industrial relations in this state on its head.
What do we want? Canada's head!
4 new government bills have taken even the most pessimistic unionist by surprise. Bill Della, Vice President of the Public Service Federation.
We're trying to say that you cannot do what you're about to do and expect to get away with it.
Kennett's reforms include measures that outlaw a worker's right to strike or take industrial action under all but very limited circumstances. Introduce fines up to $250,000 for unions and $25,000 for individuals. Introduce fines for disobedience. Abolish state awards. Abolish holiday leave loading payments. Makes payment of penalty rates negotiable. Reduce benefits for injured workers, and reduce a worker's avenue of appeal against an employer.
These pieces of legislation are the most brutal pieces of legislation that have been introduced into any country or anywhere around the world. These are the precursors to the emergence of fascism.
But yesterday, Premier Kennett sounded like he lived on a different planet from his opponents.
There is a real feeling that Victoria is going places, that we're doing something, that we're no longer the butt of jokes, that we've turned all this around in a 5-week period. Victoria is on the road back to recovery.
Ever marched in something like this before?
Never.
First time?
First time.
Have you ever marched in anything like this before?
No, not before.
This first time in a march?
First time in a march.
I'm marching because I don't want schools closed, I don't want teachers sacked, and I want childcare looked after for people like me.
They're taking away basic rights. We have no right to strike, we have no right to picket, and I think we have to come. There's absolutely no choice.
Look, the rest of the world is looking at us.
Let the streets of Melbourne thunder with the anger of Victorian workers.
Who's got their hands on the steering wheel? Is it the elected politicians or is it the unions?
Tony Beddison is a leading business consultant, an employer who, like his colleagues, is backing Jeff Kennett all the way.
I think they're putting some balance back in what was an unfair situation.
There's no doubt at all that they are seeking vengeance.
We can't afford to be paid extra money to go on holidays.
Abolishing holiday leave loading was not mentioned by Jeff Kennett before he became Premier, nor was his planned attack on penalty rates.
The fact is that many businesses can't afford to open and to operate with those rates.
But what's incensed some workers the most is the threat of disobedience fines.
It is so farcical, it's so extremist that it's not believable, but there it is, it's in the legislation.
Only yesterday, Premier Kennett said he didn't think many public servants would leave their post to rally today. Well, he's been proven wrong. Although they're not all public servants, the crowd has swelled to well over 100,000 workers from various industries, all with one major concern, the process of democracy.
I'm serious about my job, and I'm much more serious about democracy, but it should go right.
I think it's very important to make a stand so that then people don't say, why didn't people do anything? We can say we tried.
Build a bonfire, put the Liberals on the top, put the Nationals in the middle, and we'll burn the bloody lot.
Today's march was one of the biggest protest rallies in Australia's history. Unionists say it's just the beginning.
How are you going to handle ongoing industrial action?
Well, I don't think there will be. I mean, I think the bottom line is that the public voted for change. They're getting the change they voted for.
Got news for him. The strikes will continue right throughout summer, with maybe a small break for the Christmas New Year period. But while there's life in our bodies, and while there's support for us amongst the membership, we will continue to fight this government. And if that takes 4 years, then so be it. It will take 4 years.
Don't lock us into that sort of confrontation. Let's be sensible about it. Let's do what we all can do. Recognise we've all got some pain to go through.
But it seems today's crowd believe they're being forced to go through more pain than others.
When we get to the steps of Parliament, please be quiet, because you will hear their snouts whacking against the silver-plated drop in the parliamentary dining room.
Virginia Housiger reporting.
The streets.
Like the streets of Melbourne, thunder with the anger of Victorian workers.
We must progress. on the path that we have undertaken, because there is no alternative.
Good evening, Ian Henderson in Melbourne with ABC News. It was Victoria's biggest protest since the days of the Vietnam moratorium marches. 100,000 people jammed central Melbourne and 30,000 more gathered in regional centres to condemn the Kennett government's industrial reforms. John Halfpenny called it the greatest day of working class action in the state's history. Jeff Kennett said the protest was confused and vowed to push ahead with his controversial legislation. For its part, the union movement is pressing ahead too, with a 24-hour dock strike tomorrow and plans for an industrial campaign affecting public transport. Well, more on the effects of today's strike in a moment, but first, Bram Alexander's report on Melbourne's day of protest.
Within earshot of the Premier's Treasury Place office, workers from across the industrial spectrum had come to make a stand.
We will fight you. We will fight you as long and as hard as it takes to defend what we've got.
John Halfpenny's rallying call was quickly and enthusiastically embraced, and the tens of thousands weren't put off by the threatening weather.
Let the streets of Melbourne thunder with the anger of Victorian workers.
The sheer numbers forced police to extend the route of the march to Elizabeth Street. Even then, the tail end was still leaving the Treasury Gardens as the main march arrived at Parliament House. Unionists say today's march and rally is just the forerunner to a long, hot summer of action against the Kennett government's reforms. From tomorrow, they'll wage a guerrilla campaign. Each day, different services and government activities will be hit. Tonight, the Port of Melbourne will be shut by a 24-hour strike. On Thursday, public transport unions will also consider strike action. The militant mood fuelled by fears about cuts in wages and conditions.
Being a shift worker, I could end up working for half as much a fortnight that I am now, just about.
Destroy the Kennett government, mate.
Is it that bad?
People have had enough of it.
Already?
Already, mate.
New changes to schools and primary schools, I see that as very detrimental and backward thinking.
Today's marchers were met by a strong police cordon at Parliament, but their calls for Jeff Kennett to address them were predictably ignored.
Our demand is not to amend the legislation. Our demand is to repeal it and throw it out.
So now Mr Halfpenny has had his day. I call on him now to put away the banners, to withhold any further industrial action, to recognise that we all have a responsibility now to get on with the job. If he is prepared to do that, I'm prepared to meet with him.
But before he agrees to talk, Mr Halfpenny says the legislation must be withdrawn. For now, the standoff continues.
Rallies in regional centres were also well attended. Workers in Geelong declared the Kennett government's honeymoon was over. And from the Latrobe Valley, ominous warnings of possible disruption to power supplies. Julia Baggio reports.
With our brothers and our sisters, together we will stand. There is power in our union. We say there is power in our union.
Premier Kennett's team, according to more than 10,000 Geelong workers. Hundreds more from the Western District and the coast journeyed across the state to add their voices. There was little evidence today of the community goodwill that propelled 5 local Liberals into Parliament a month ago. And regional union leaders were making the most of it.
Mr Kennett said, I'll look after Geelong personally. Quite frankly, we don't want him to represent Geelong. The honeymoon is over and we want a divorce.
Ill-founded or not, the anxieties of more than 10,000 people cannot be ignored, especially in a town where the Premier has promised personal attention. Another 4,000 protesters filled the streets of Bendigo in the region's biggest rally for 20 years. Members of 20 different unions marched on the office of Local Member and Government Minister Michael John. And in the Latrobe Valley, a taste of trouble to come. 8,000 workers from 30 unions walked off the job with discussions centring on the power union's plans for massive disruptions in coming weeks.
When they jail a man for striking, it's a rich man's country, yeah. When they jail a man for striking, it's a rich man's country, yeah.
While union leaders are hailing the marches as a huge success, employers say only 10% of Victoria's private workforce took part. Most of those who went on strike today were public sector workers, and for the public, disruptions were minimal.
Anyone entering Victoria today was warned. Disruption was widespread, but certainly nowhere near as crippling as feared. Nearly all international flights in and out of Melbourne were cancelled. All hands were called in as baggage handlers and refuelers walked off the job. Australian Airlines stopped 20 domestic flights and Ansett reported some delays. Victoria did do business today, though to varying degrees. Most shops traded, some with less staff than usual. Public opinion was divided. Really, I'm not in a union, but I do support the strike.
Don't you think perhaps in the past that they've had just a little too much?
Most businesses opened, some operating on a skeleton staff, with the Transport Workers Union leaving many trucks lying idle. While union leaders are claiming success, employers say only 10% of the private workforce went on strike, though it's still bad for business.
Well, in terms of the immediate lost wages and productivity, it could be between $100 and $200 million, but it could be a much higher figure if we take into account that potential for lost investment.
But most who marched were public sector workers, with unions claiming most public service departments either closed or operated on limited staff. Most schools were affected, some were closed while many others provided basic care.
The children in classes whose teachers have stopped work are getting childcare only.
In hospitals, nurses walked off the job at 2 o'clock, though only briefly, to protest their loss of penalty rates. Catering staff and cleaners did strike, leaving administrators and medical staff to feed the patients.
A lot of broken plates, but we're coping.
Union leaders are confident that today's response will provide a boost to the National Day of Action planned for the end of the month.
Our national industrial reporter Bronwyn Young was at today's rally to gauge the mood of Victorian workers, and she joins us now live. Well, Bronwyn, the unions clearly see today's protest as an unqualified success.
Yes, it certainly was. Even on their own estimates, the estimates they provided the police, they got double the numbers that they were expecting. And I think what's really interesting to note is that it wasn't just die-hard unionists that turned out. You could just see middle Victoria lining the streets.
Well, pressure's clearly mounting on Jeff Kennett. Any signs of him cracking?
Well, he says definitely no at this stage. But I think even if he isn't prepared to give in to direct union pressure, what's going to happen is that he's going to come under significant pressure from his own constituency, which is the business community, because I think they're going to be very worried that prolonged industrial action is going to affect their profits. And of course, they want nothing like that at the moment.
So will these new strikes at the docks and perhaps public transport increase the pressure on him?
Look, they may do, but the thing is that from the union's point of view, it's a really high-risk strategy because these strikes are going to directly affect the public, and the last thing that the union movement can afford to do at the moment is in fact get the general public offside. If they do that, they've lost the war. Now,
the whole of Australia was watching Victoria today. What are the national implications of today's protest?
Well, if the protest today had fizzed, then the ACTU's National Day of Action against the ACTU would have fizzed as well. In fact, I think what you see today is the groundwork being laid for the ACTU's campaign, its whole campaign against the federal opposition leading up to the next election.
Bronwyn, that's all we have time for at the moment. Thanks very much for joining us. Our industrial reporter, Bronwyn Young. Well, Victoria's strike was also the focus in Canberra today. Paul Keating accused the Kennett government of belting up workers and claimed the chaos in Victoria would be repeated across Australia if John Hewson became Prime Minister. Opposition frontbencher John Howard accused Mr Keating of provoking confrontation to win votes. Jim Middleton has the details.
John Hewson thinks there's something for him in Victoria's general strike.
And I remind the Prime Minister that his economic policies have not only destroyed the Victorian economy, but in human terms have thrown 300,000 people out of work in that state.
Paul Keating's just as convinced he can make mileage out of the Kennett government's tough stand.
Now, it's the revenge of the old boys. With the silver service out, the pay increase in the middle of the night,
building up ordinary people with their pay and conditions without a mandate.
The Prime Minister went on to accuse opposition frontbencher John Howard of concealing his real industrial relations agenda, just as Jeff Kennett did his decision to abolish penalties and leave loadings.
No, says the member for Bennelong, we will not be releasing the bill. Well, we have to say, John, why not? What have you got to hide?
Last week, Mr Howard criticised his Victorian Liberal colleagues for changing their tune on penalties and leave loadings after the state election. Today, though, he's right behind the new Victorian Premier.
I think Jeff Kennett deserves the 100% support of this Parliament. What he has done, Mr Deputy Speaker, is to implement an industrial relations policy for which he has received a mandate.
But it appears Mr Kennett has already given Paul Keating a leg up. Newspoll in today's Australian has the ALP on 45%, up fully 8 points in a fortnight, and 4 points ahead of the Coalition on 41. The first time Labor's primary vote has topped the opposition's since before the 1990 election. It's the first national opinion poll since Jeff Kennett took on the unions. The first since Paul Keating pledged not to oppose the GST in the Senate if Labor loses next year's election. The result won applause for the Prime Minister from caucus. John Hewson told the opposition party room,
bigger than the moratorium rallies, Victoria's day of protest drew determined marchers, some who have never before taken to the streets.
Has a mandate to make such drastic changes to industrial relations laws.
Welcome to the 7:30 report. Thanks for joining me. Over 100,000 people in Melbourne alone maintained their rage today against the Kennett government's radical strategies for change. And the Premier's response?
And I can understand those who demonstrated today and did so, I thought, in good spirit, and did so responsibly, and I can congratulate all involved in the way in which it was conducted. They are confused. They have been fed a great deal of misinformation, and at the end of the day, sir, I am sure that they, with the majority of Victorians, sir, will appreciate that at last, after 10 years, they have a government that is prepared to govern.
While Mr Kennett gave the marchers good marks for behaviour, they certainly didn't appear confused about their mission today. Kathy Boland was there.
Jeff Kennett's favourite music took on a touch of irony today. The Premier could not ignore the cries of the angry men and women outside Parliament. The response to the union's call to arms was overwhelming. An estimated 100,000 people flocked to the streets, overturning the Premier's prediction that the rally would be a failure. At 10 o'clock this morning, the top end of the city was at a standstill. But the crowd made way for John Halfpenny, the man responsible for the strike. As the marchers moved off towards Parliament House, the crowd filled the streets for an entire city block.
One of the notable things about today's march was the number of people who'd either never marched before or hadn't taken to the streets since the Vietnam marches 2 decades ago.
I've never marched before, but I think this is something special, and you can feel it in the crowd.
What's special about it?
I think you can feel that the working classes are starting to unite under one cause.
Well, I'm marching to protect the rights of people. I'm at home, I don't work, but if anyone's rights are under attack, my rights are under attack too.
Have you ever marched before?
In the Whitlam time.
I'm a public servant. I feel eroding our rights for one, but also just in general the whole of everybody's rights. Haven't since the Vietnam moratorium. I've never been on strike in 22 years of work.
Why are the kids along?
Because they're students at a primary school, a state primary school, and the changes that he's envisaging will have a real effect on their education.
Workers' rights, because we will not be told by that man.
Have you ever marched before?
Yes, I have. I marched at the Vietnam moratoriums. But usually I'm a peace-loving, ordinary citizen.
The Vietnam rallies were the largest ever seen in this country, and they forced the government to change its attitude to our involvement in that war. At its height, the moratorium drew crowds of around 100,000. Today's rally was of similar magnitude, and the man who led the protests 2 decades ago was there today.
It had a very big influence. The Australian government in Canberra that had sent the troops to Vietnam was never the same afterwards. It had a very great influence. They stopped escalating the war and they withdrew partly under the influence of that.
And this one?
This one is different. There is what you can hear now. There's a force, there's a power, there's an energy, there's an anger about this today which wasn't there then. Now, they feel angry because, in a sense, that man up there has completely ignored anyone who disagrees with him.
We don't want your legislation. We want our awards. We want our entitlements. We want those things that we have fought for. The things that we have fought for are the things that Kennett and the employers want to take away. And just as we fought to get them, we will fight to keep them.
The huge turnout was an undeniable testimony to the level of concern among workers over the government's moves to scrap the holiday leave loading, jeopardise penalty rates, revamp workers' compensation and virtually outlaw strikes. The rapid moves have polarised Victorian society.
That you cannot expect any cooperation, any respect from the trade union movement and trade unionists if you insist upon abusing our rights and trying to steal away our entitlements, our benefits, our awards, our work care protection and all of the other things that you and your greedy boss mates want to get their grubby little fingers on.
Of course, many workers did not take to the streets today. Most city shops were still trading. The largest retailer, Coles Myer, reported just 70 of its 2,300 staff on strike. However, concern was still high among some who chose not to join the strike.
I chose to work because, although I believe in the march that happened today, it initially concerned me when Mr Kennett had said that he would take down names of people that didn't work, and I felt that just starting as a young person, starting a job, I could do without that pressure.
Basically because I want to keep my job. I want to work. I mean, I don't know for a fact that I'd lose my job if I went and protested, but I want to work.
I feel confident enough to maintain my job. I don't feel confident enough to be striking up deals. No, not at this stage, no.
Today's rally was the first in the union's carefully planned strategy of civil disobedience. Those who joined the protest know that under the legislation they're trying to overturn, such action could lead to fines of $1,000 per person and $50,000 per union.
Kathy Boland and Susie Goodman prepared that report. Well, joining me now in the studio is Mr John Hyde from the Institute of Public Affairs, Mr Robert Hawkes from the Association of Independent Businesses, and Mr Bill Della from the State Public Services Federation. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Mr Della, to you first. Obviously the union movement is flushed with success after today, but Mr Kennett has said the legislation will be rammed through Parliament anyway.
We're also tempered with the enormous strength of today, Mary, and I think that Mr Kennett will understand over the next 3 or 4 weeks that we are very serious, that there will be significant disruption to industry in Victoria, and we regret that, but unfortunately it's what it's going to take in order to convince him that he has to change his position and stop being driven by the ideology that's driving him at the moment.
As our reporter just said, Victoria is now polarised as a result of today. But what will the union settle for? Mr Halfpenny today called for the repeal of the legislation. Now, obviously that is not going to happen. What realistically will the unions accept?
Well, I think we'll have to wait and see whether that's going to happen. The legislation is really only repeating the sorts of experiences that were introduced into Germany in the early 1930s. There is no other comparable legislation anywhere in the world. It leaps beyond New Zealand, it leaps beyond New South Wales, and it leaps beyond what's happening in Tasmania.
So there's no room for negotiation?
There's room for negotiation if the government are prepared to move away from their hardline ideological position, but only if, and if not, there will be, as Halfpenny says quite correctly, a long, hot summer of industrial action.
Mr Hyde, you've been long an advocate for change, particularly on the Fraser backbench. You have advised this particular government on much of the legislative reforms. Is this your recipe, and did you expect this response?
It's not exactly our recipe, and it's not strictly true to say we've advised this government, and only in the sense that we have published on this topic, and we've advised everybody, including the opposition, if they will take our views on board. I guess I expected something of this sort of response. The numbers are a bit higher than I anticipated, yes, but I mean, I didn't give the numbers a lot of thought. Look, our thought was for the unemployed, and we have to ask what this is doing for employment. I mean, is it a good thing or a bad thing that we've had this rally today? Is the legislation, in fact, each clause of the legislation, a good or bad thing for unemployment?
What do you think?
On the balance, the legislation is good for the unemployed, and clearly, well, 17.5%, the one bit that the public weren't told about before the election, that if you reduce the cost of employing people in the public sector, where the case is clearest, Mr Kennett says that that will allow 700 more people to be employed. Those figures are roughly right.
But where is the evidence, Mr Hyde, in another Western economy where such fierce deregulation of labour like this has achieved the creation of more jobs?
The UK was one, but Germany going back a long way, but better still New Zealand most recently, where, there is growth in employment because of somewhat more deregulation than we've had, not less. And there are differences in the two legislations, but it's somewhat more radical, not less.
Mr Hawkes, if I can ask you, is there a middle way? Have these reforms been too draconian or just handled insensitively?
Well, I think a little bit of both, Mary. I think that there's a lot of very scared people out there, and I think we've got to find some middle ground at this stage. The last thing that the small business communities can handle in Australia is a massive industrial unrest at this stage. We've got somewhere between 60 and 80,000 small businesses that possibly won't get through the next 12 months. That's the figures we got out with the assistance of the banks, and they incidentally employ about 400,000 Australians. Now, we've got to prevent that catastrophe and those extra 4%, which would run our unemployment up to about 2 million. So people have got to be of goodwill in this, and we've got to put
the goodwill's gone. We've seen today, haven't we?
I don't know about that. I think that still on the union side, I think that still in government, we've got to try and resolve this, and we've got to get people to sit down and sensibly look at finding a middle road on this one.
Gentlemen, if you'd mind staying with me on the program, can I come back to you shortly? But first, let's ask whether the government is going beyond its mandate. Just how much were we told before the election? Is the government simply holding to its promises, or is it breaking them? Our state political reporter Michael Short and Ross Hampton prepared this report on before and after October the 3rd.
This government has a very clear mandate to put into practice this particular piece of legislation, which was well debated during the election and which was well understood by the community.
And on the question of time, Mr Speaker, whether they like it or not, the fact is that the papers room have already run out of copies of this bill, and there will be no more copies of this bill until Monday at the earliest. And this is a bill, as I've indicated, Mr Speaker, of such fundamental concern that they want to railroad it through the Parliament.
Victoria's new administration is setting such a pace that even the government printer is having trouble keeping up. The Kennett government has a massive mandate, but for what? Just how many of its changes were detailed clearly before the election.
We want to make sure that everything that we offered prior to the election is actually in force in legislation.
I wouldn't put it in the terms of misled the community, but I think the government really said to the community, that's all we're revealing for the moment, take us on trust.
Under a Victorian coalition government, all employees covered by state awards...
August 23, and the coalition releases its industrial relations policy.
The
Coalition policy would also end compulsory unionism, allow ordinary time to be worked in any 5 consecutive days, or in other words, an end to weekend penalty rates, and the State Industrial Relations Commission would be replaced with the Employee Relations Commission.
The direction was clear before the election, but it wasn't until Phil Goode presented the bill to Parliament that some crucial details were revealed. In fact, the government has captured national attention with a box of surprises. Within a month of the election came a mini-budget. Taxes and charges were raised, a so-called Kane-Kerner tax was levied on every property, and spending was cut across the board. Then came the legislation that outlawed strikes. It imposed heavy fines on employees, effectively limited picket lines to 6, and virtually wiped out secondary boycotts.
Industrial action must conform to the settlement procedures specified in the agreements, otherwise it is deemed unlawful.
Before the election, the Coalition declined a direct opportunity to flag the imminent changes. If the unions don't capitulate to the sort of changes that you're seeking, you've got strike-breaking legislation ready to go too, haven't you?
Well, it's not a matter of capitulation by anybody. What we're on about, as I said, is to put in place a system that enables individuals to take charge.
We have a very clear mandate for the changes that we think are necessary and the public voted for. In all areas, with the exception of one, the public were well informed before the election.
The government are trying to say that the outlines were known, and if you read between the lines of the outline, you'd recognise this is what was going to happen. But I don't believe that's correct.
With the exception of the 17.5%, everything that we promised before the election is in fact in place.
The Premier admitted that pulling the holiday loading move out of the hat was a surprise to Victorians, but he blamed the former government for leaving a worse than expected financial mess.
Not offering anything more than a minimum rate with no penalty.
I'm sorry, that's totally wrong. They will not lose 1 cent, not 1 hour of overtime, shift work, penalty rates.
And then there's been the confusion over penalty rates. The policy suggested they were out, but Coalition press releases said they were in. Along came the legislation and they were out.
Awards which provide that ordinary hours worked on Saturday and Sunday attract penalty rates will not be able to continue.
And they were out in a government briefing paper obtained by the 7:30 report. But there are now amendments to the legislation that effectively mean they are out of awards but can be rolled over into contracts for those who've already got a job.
Yes, there is confusion, drummed up, I think, fundamentally by the Trades Hall Council.
I think that the Trades Hall has grounds for a march because there's no way of consulting with the government. The government has made it clear that it will not consult, that not enough information came through about the legislation before the election, and the trade union movement, in my view, feels it only has one recourse, which is to get out on the streets and show solidarity.
Many of today's marchers were public servants, a group that's already been given a few surprises by the new government. Despite a pre-election undertaking, the government abolished the Public Service Board. Despite an election eve claim that it had no plans to put public servants on contracts, the government has begun to do so. And despite refusing before the election to nominate how many public service jobs might go, the government says 7,000 before next July and 11 or 12,000 after that. Not so different, incidentally, from a pre-election tip-off by Des Moore, a prominent free market campaigner.
And cuts in public service employment over a period of time of over 25,000.
Well, we don't know how many will sack, and I think the new public sector under a coalition government will be a very exciting place to work.
There were a couple of other symbolic surprises. In Parliament House, ceremonial wigs and the silver dining service were dusted off, and pay rises were granted to some members of the government, before being cut or rejected amid a public outcry.
Hello, I'm Phil Goode, and my job is to bring employment agreements to Victoria.
The situation remains so confused that the government is spending hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to sell the changes.
Employment agreements will be good for employees, good for employers, and good for Victoria. When you know the facts, I think you'll agree.
Just a few months ago, Phil Goode seemed to think that selling the changes would be a lot easier.
The success of the change that we take place will give others the courage to come down the same path with us. When they see the opportunities that are going to be made available through this process and the solid outcomes that are achievable, I'm sure that other states in the Commonwealth will want to come down the same sensible path that we're intending to travel.
Michael Short reporting. Well, during these weeks of major change in this state, the 7:30 report has extended many invitations to the Premier to appear on the program. In particular, last week when the legislation was introduced into Parliament, and again yesterday, we invited Mr Kennett to join us tonight. However, he has once again declined. Unfortunately, Mr Good was also unavailable tonight. Well, back to our panel now, and I wonder if I can go to you, Mr Hyde. Regardless of the correctness of the theory of deregulation, would you not agree that the political handling of this dispute has been bad? I mean, we look at the amendments, we look at the flip-flop over penalties, we look even at the government pay rises.
Okay, look, of course it could have been better handled, there's no doubt about that. However, you know, some of the implication of what you're saying is not fair. If a government is moving at the fast rate that this one has to, I mean, it might have expected 1 point off its Moody's rating, not 2. That really did take it by surprise. And in any case, given the mess that the Victoria public sector finances are in, drastic action was called for.
How would you have handled it, Mr Hyde?
I don't have the skills to be a Premier, and I don't pretend that I do. My point rather is that not coming on a 7:30 report when he has the problems that he has to deal with in government just means that he hasn't got the time, I suspect. Look, the job really is very difficult. I've sat behind Malcolm Fraser in less stress time than this and seen him come under enormous pressure. Now, Kennett and Good and co must be flat out trying to get things right. And of course they've made mistakes. Some of them with hindsight they shouldn't have made, that's true. But that's inevitable.
Which ones would you suggest that they could have done without?
The pay rise one was the most serious in a straight political sense. But, you know, there are some things that, with hindsight, you would explain and differently and use other words. But when you're operating at that pace, they don't have all the time that a reporter on a TV show's got to prepare their case and so on. They move from one thing to another. Look, I've sat behind ministers and been pretty critical of them, but really these guys are coping with a lot in the worst situation that Australia has faced since the 1930s.
Can I put it to you, Mr Hyde, that democracy is a delicate instrument, that it doesn't just end at the ballot box, despite the massive vote that this government received?
I think that.
And is there not room for consultation?
Now, glad you raised that. If you mean going and talking to the trade union movement or the Melbourne Club, no. The sort of consultation there must be is that's done publicly. The sort of consultation through the 7:30 report is fine. There's only just time's a problem. But no, a government should not get into bed with vested interests, and that's where we've gone wrong. And I don't care which group of vested interests. We're no happy about them, you know, chatting up with a whole lot of industrialists either.
So which vested interest has this government listened too closely to?
This government probably hasn't listened. That is a radical change, probably the most radical change that has been made. It has gone ahead and done broadly what it said it was going to do. Look, if you read the manifestos of incoming governments, the ones I'm most familiar with are those that have come in Canberra. But this one, on this subject, was more detailed, much more detailed than normal. Not on some other subjects, I concede, but on this one it was.
Mr Hawkes, if I can go to you, why is it that business hasn't really declared its hand in this case? People have said to us privately that they disapprove of the rate of pace, but they're really reluctant to come on camera and discuss that.
Well, I don't know why they're reluctant, but what I would say is this, is that over the last 100 years, we've built up in this country probably arguably one of the best, if not the best, industrial relations systems in the world. Now, the Harvester Award, which we brought in the early 1900s, gave a living wage for a man, woman and 2 children. That was a world first. And it's been a great system that served us very well. And yes, it's got tarnished in recent years because there's been excesses, and we're all aware of that. But those excesses haven't been just from the trade union movement. They've been excesses by business. We read about them every day, by governments, by bureaucrats, and yes, by the trade union movement. And they need to be cleaned up. And the job of cleaning those up has begun. And we're very concerned that it's going to be derailed at this stage by people who are taking too hard and too fast a line because the process is underway. Now, look,
But small business appears, from what Peter Boyle was saying last night on this program, appears to be 100% behind the Kennett government's changes.
Well, we're not finding that among our members or among our association. I suggest there's a much more moderate line that needs to be taken. We've got a very, very fragile situation out there, and we need to be sitting down with the trade unions, with the government. After all, it is Her Majesty's Victorian government that's there to run this state on behalf of everybody in the state.
Mr Dillard, just quickly, what are the national implications of today's turnout?
Well, I think a number of things. I think as a social laboratory, Victoria has just replaced Tasmania and New South Wales, and I think the Keating government would be delighted about that. I think that quite clearly the focus on industrial relations at the next federal election and on the GST will mean that the Keating government is now a shoo-in to be re-elected, and as I said, I think he would be delighted about today's activities in Melbourne.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time tonight. I appreciate it. Well, is the Victorian experience a mirror of what we can expect under a Hewson federal government? Paul Lynham is discussing today's events and their significance with the Federal Industrial Relations Minister, Mr Peter Cook, and the Opposition's Mr John Howard.
Gentlemen, thanks to you both for joining us. Pleasure. Now, I know this makes passions run hot, this issue, but please, let's try to shed more light than heat. Let's not try and talk over each other. Senator Cook, with 300,000 Victorians out of work and the state deeply in debt, Victoria needs today's strike, I would have thought, like a hole in the head.
Yes, I would have thought Jeff Kennett would have done what Bob Hawke did in '83 and bring Australia back together with a National Economic Summit, create a degree of cooperation in the community, not rip money off families and cause living standards to fall and attack civil rights of ordinary Victorians.
Mr Howard, in its editorial today, the Melbourne Age said this: "It would have been better for this state if this stoppage had not been called. Better still, had it not been provoked." Is that not fair comment?
Well, I think that the reason we're having the dispute is that the union movement in Victoria, aided and abetted by the Keating government, will not accept the verdict of the Victorian people. I mean, Peter Cook talked about Bob Hawke in 1983. Peter, one of the reasons that Hawke got off to a good start in 1983 was that the business community and the Liberal opposition did not try and frustrate the mandate he had. In fact, the business community said, we didn't vote for you, but we'll give you a chance. Now, hang on, let me finish. That is the very thing that the union movement and you lot are refusing to do to the Kennett government in Victoria. After 10 years of destroying the state of Victoria, you people have got the nerve to frustrate the mandate of a duly elected government.
Right, what Bob Hawke did was provide a bit of leadership. Before he did anything, he called the nation together and wrought an economic plan for the recovery of Australia. That's
but
what
he
Bob
had the
Hawke
cooperation,
did.
though.
He had the cooperation because he never confronted anyone to begin with. He never took wages off ordinary workers. He never reduced living standards. He never imposed a poll tax across the economy. And he never said that you're going to take these things and we'll run the legislation through before you've got a chance to comment.
All right. Now, Mr Howard, how can you say that Jeff Kennett has a mandate for this when he said before the election no worker would be worse off by $1? And indeed, you said recently it was a pity Mr Kennett's removal of those loadings was contrary to his election pledge.
Yes, look, I make no bones about the fact that there are one or two areas where our policy is different. And there are also, well, let me finish. I mean, hang on, you let me finish. But the main elements of the Kennett program, that is workplace agreements and the end of union privileges, which is really the thing you dislike most of all, and the end of compulsory unionism, they are the main elements of Kennett's program, and he made them perfectly clear before the election, and he is adhering to those things after the election.
Well, he didn't tell people all about those things before the election, but now, because he had a bill that he produced 3 days after the election, which said
saying he didn't
mention his bill. And we haven't heard from you, Mr Howard, about your bill. You told us earlier that you had a bill to produce. You've produced a policy, you haven't produced your bill. When are we going to see your bill?
Now, before we
so your credibility is right on the line here.
Minister, before we get on to the federal implications of this, I mean, the opinion polls say that today's strike in Victoria is not supported by the majority of Victorians. If one is a Democrat, surely you can't ignore that sort of voice.
Well, look, I wouldn't be surprised if that were true, but the effect is that people have had benefits removed. They were promised that they wouldn't do that. And what in a civilised and democratic society can people do in those circumstances but protest? But protest before they lose the right to do so, because under this legislation, any industrial action, turning up late for work, for example, can be deemed to be in breach of your contract and thus a criminal offence. Now, when ordinary Australian workers can be put in jail as criminals because they differ with their employer about the nature of the employment contract. That is abysmal. No wonder there were people who
Senator Cook, you know there's no provision for a jail sentence in that bill. Why did you say that? Why did you misrepresent that? Why did you say that?
I did not.
You said they could be put in jail.
I did not.
Yes, you did.
I know you're agitated about this because your whole...
You said...
Mr. Howard, look, I would like to move this debate forward, please. Mr. Howard, you said today that Jeff...
They can't, it's not in the bill.
Mr. Howard, you said today that Jeff Kennett deserves the 100% support of the federal parliament. Doesn't this give federal Labor more opportunity to say, there you go, Kennett in Victoria is merely a dry run for Howard across the nation?
Oh, but they're going to say, look, it doesn't matter what I say or what you say. Paul Keating will say or do anything to lie his way back into office. It doesn't matter how I behave or how John Hewson behaves or how Jeff Kennett behaves. But look, today's strike is resented by most Victorians. Today's strike, after all that the Labor Party has done to Victoria, is the most unjustified political strike that we have seen in this country for 10 years. I mean, these people destroyed that state.
You promised to produce your bill. You haven't done so. Ever since you've produced your policy, you've tried to rewrite it with press release and walk away from the black letter commitment of your policy. We had the example of the Kennett government bring out a bill 3 days after the election, which was different from what their policy said. But hey presto, before the Victorians could even blink, there was a bill ready formed to enact. Now, your word in reinterpreting your own policy and saying, trust me, I'll do the right thing, has not to be accepted, because what we're seeing played out in Victoria, frankly, is a foretaste of what Liberal Party industrial relations policy would do to this nation should you ever get into power.
All right.
That was Paul Lynham in Canberra with John Howard and Senator Peter Cook. That's our program for tonight. Thank you very much for being with us. I'll see you again at 7:30 tomorrow. Good night.